John Daly is 60 years old, and he has spent most of his adult life making headlines for everything except the thing that motivated him most deeply. The drinking, the gambling, the suspensions, the 4 marriages, all of it got the ink. The love he had for the people he shared the game with barely registered. At 60, John Daly has finally said out loud who those people were, and what he says about them tells you more about who he actually is than any headline ever managed. Here's the full story. The first thing you have to understand about John Daly's opinions on his fellow golfers is why they carry a different kind of weight than the opinions of most professionals. Golf exists in a particular social ecosystem. The touring professional world is comfortable and well-mannered and careful. Players are guarded in what they say about each other, aware that relationships matter for sponsorship and pairings and social capital. Nobody burns bridges on purpose. The careful, measured professional opinion is the default. John Daly was never that. He was the 9th alternate at the 1991 PGA Championship, who drove through the night from Memphis, showed up without a practice round, and won the tournament. He was the beer-drinking, cigarette-smoking, long-hitting embodiment of everything that polished professional golf was not supposed to celebrate. And because he was outside the social norms from the very beginning, he never fully adopted the careful language those norms produce. When John Daly says he loved someone, the word means something. It has not been filtered through a publicist or softened for palatability. It is just what he felt, which makes his revelations about the golfers he loved across his career one of the most honest portraits of a sporting generation that professional golf has produced. Start with Arnold Palmer, because anyone who has spent time listening to John Daly talk about the game eventually arrives at Arnold Palmer as the answer to the question of who he admired most. When Palmer died in September of 2016, Daly's tribute said everything you needed to know about the depth of that feeling. He called Palmer the legend of all legends in the game of golf, and said he had always loved him, and always would, and he signed off with God bless. 3 lines, no flourish, no carefully constructed sentiment, just the grief of someone who had lost a man who mattered to him personally. The relationship between Daly and Palmer was one of the quieter friendships of the modern game. Palmer represented everything Daly aspired to in terms of how a champion carries himself with the public. Arnold Palmer was the original people's champion, the man who made the gallery feel like it was part of something, the golfer who signed autographs until everyone had one. Daly adopted that same philosophy from the very beginning of his career, staying behind the ropes long after any reasonable person would have called it a night, talking to the fans who showed up in Walmart shirts and waited in the rain. He learned that from watching Palmer. They even shared a specific experience in Scotland. When Daly won the 1995 Open Championship at St Andrews, he talked afterward about how the R&A officials were not exactly thrilled with an American outsider taking the claret jug home. He discussed it with Palmer, who told him he had experienced the same thing when he won at St Andrews in 1961. The two men bonded over being the wrong kind of winner in the right kind of setting. That conversation is the kind of thing that forms real friendships, the recognition that two people navigated the same specific situation and came out the same way. Quick pause. If Arnold Palmer is your all-time favorite golfer, the king, the man who made the game what it is for millions of people, type Arnie's Army in the comments. If there is a different player from that golden era who does it for you, name them below. I read every single one. The second name Daly has returned to throughout his career, in a different register entirely, is Payne Stewart. This one is not admiration from a distance, it is grief up close. Stewart and Daly were contemporaries, competitors, and close personal friends during the years when both were at their competitive peaks. Stewart was everything Daly was not, in terms of presentation: elegant, classically dressed in +4s and tam o' a former US Open champion who looked like he had been poured into the role of touring professional. And yet the two men found each other at the human level that exists beneath all the surface differences. They played cards, they told stories, they genuinely enjoyed each other's company on a tour circuit that can feel deeply lonely when the crowds go home. On October 25, 1999, the private jet carrying Stewart and 5 others depressurized after takeoff. Everyone on board lost consciousness. The plane flew on autopilot for hours before crashing in a South Dakota field. Payne Stewart was 42 years old. Daly has spoken about that loss on multiple occasions over the years, and the emotion has never fully settled into something he can describe cleanly. Stewart's death came during a period of Daly's own personal turbulence, at a moment when a close friend was one of the things he could least afford to lose. He has never pretended that it was anything other than devastating. Lee Trevino belongs on this list not because their relationship was the closest Daly had on tour, but because of what Trevino represented to Daly as a model. Trevino was the Mexican-American kid who grew up in poverty, who taught himself to play on a course he could barely afford to access, who arrived on the PGA Tour with a swing that every instructor in the world said was wrong, and won 6 major championships with it anyway. The parallel to Daly's own story, the outsider who showed up without the standard credentials and beat the people who had them, is not subtle. Daly has cited Trevino as a figure he looked to as proof that the game did not belong exclusively to the country club world, that someone built like him and raised the way he was raised could stand on the same stage as anyone, and not just survive, but dominate. Fred Couples completes the picture in a different way. Couples and Daly came up in similar eras, both known for prodigious natural talent, both beloved by galleries for the effortless quality their golf had even at its most spectacular. Couples, who won the 1992 Masters and spent years as one of the most charismatic players in the sport, was the version of easygoing brilliance that Daly recognized in himself when he was at his best. The two were known to be genuine friends, not the managed friendliness of tour professionals who share pairings and press rooms, but actual friends who enjoyed each other's company away from the game. Couples represents the golfer Daly perhaps wanted to be perceived as more consistently, someone whose talent generated awe, and whose personality generated warmth without the surrounding chaos that followed Daly everywhere. And then there is Jack Nicklaus, who fits on this list differently from all the others. Daly's love for Nicklaus is not the love of a peer or a friend. It is something closer to reverence, the way a player who came from almost nothing looks at the man who accumulated more than anyone. Daly has spoken about Nicklaus as the greatest who ever lived, and he says it without qualification or nuance, simply as a statement of fact that he has accepted completely. What connects them in Daly's mind is something specific. Nicklaus always treated Daly with respect. In a sport where the establishment had its doubts about the long-hitting Arkansas kid with the drinking problem and the tendency to disappear without notice, Nicklaus was one of the figures who extended genuine professional courtesy. When someone who has earned everything the game offers treats you like you belong, it leaves a mark. Daly has never forgotten it. The 5 golfers who define Daly's emotional life inside the game are Palmer the idol, Stewart the friend, Trevino the model, Couples the mirror, and Nicklaus the standard. Each relationship tells a different part of the same story about who Daly actually is when stripped of the mythology that surrounds him. What ties all of these relationships together is the thing that John Daly has always been, beneath every headline that reduced him to a punchline. He is a man who felt things deeply and wore those feelings on the outside rather than managing them carefully the way his profession expected him to. His love for Palmer was the love of a student who found a model worth following. His grief for Stewart was the grief of a man who did not have enough people close enough to him and lost one of the ones he did. His admiration for Trevino was the admiration of one outsider for another who showed that the game had room for people who did not fit the mold. His friendship with Couples was the comfort of recognizing something of yourself in someone else. His reverence for Nicklaus was the reverence of a man who, despite everything, wanted his place in the history of the game to be taken seriously. The PGA Tour gave him 7 suspensions. It fined him more than $100,000. It cited him repeatedly for conduct unbecoming a professional. And through all of it, the men who stood on those leaderboards with him, the ones who knew him not from a newspaper but from a Tuesday practice round, or a hotel lobby at midnight, or a conversation in a locker room that nobody else heard, kept showing up in his life as proof that the game was not simply tolerating John Daly. It was, in its own way, loving him back. At 60, John Daly has survived things that would have ended most careers and most men. The cancer, the body, the money, the marriages, none of it finished him. He is still here, still competing in what tournaments his body allows, still signing autographs until everyone who wants one has one, still being exactly who he was when he drove through the night from Memphis as a 25-year-old with nothing to lose. And the golfers he loved across those decades, some gone and some still with us, are the quiet architecture of the life that kept him standing through everything that tried to knock him down. The galleries that waited for him behind the ropes all those years were not wrong about who John Daly was. They saw the same thing Palmer saw, and Stewart, and Trevino, and Couples, and Nicklaus. Underneath the cigarette and the mountain of Diet Coke cans and the colorful trousers was somebody who loved the game and the people in it, and was never remotely careful about saying so. If this portrait of Daly landed differently than the headlines did, drop a like before you scroll away. It tells the algorithm to push this to other golf fans who deserve to see the full picture. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming every week.